Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for July through October. I'm Gina Palma. Recently, across the Great Basin, fire activity has increased significantly with several large fires and several CIMT mobilizations from eastern Nevada into Utah and up into western Wyoming. Looking at how conditions have changed over the last month, in June, we saw very warm temperatures, especially across Nevada and Utah. In many periods throughout June, we saw temperatures 10 to 20 degrees or more above normal. We did have some cooling across the north, and this was largely due to a very strong cold front that moved into the northern Great Basin and pushed across the region late in June. Precipitation, we generally saw very little precipitation. We did have some isolated thunderstorms in parts of the south and over Utah, which did drop very localized amounts of rainfall. However, the main cold front in the north brought some wetting rains and even some high elevation snowfall to central and southwest Idaho and northern Nevada. So you can see those areas did pop up above normal, or at least near to above normal for precipitation for June. But even in areas over western Wyoming, where we saw recent precipitation and even some high elevation snowfall, still generally below normal. If we look at the precipitation since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, 2025, you can see obviously below normal precipitation really across much of the west, but across nearly all of the Great Basin with the exception of around the periphery. We saw some near to just above normal precipitation averaged out in the south, up in northwest Nevada, and around parts of the north. But again, very localized. Our snowpack obviously was very poor. We saw very warm and dry conditions nearly all winter. We did see a little bit better snowpack in the north, where in late March, which is typically our peak of snowpack, we saw snowpack above 60%, but that's still below normal. The rest of the west, really into the Great Basin, was very poor snowpack, and this is still important now because this does play a role into the state of our fuel conditions. So currently our soil moisture is very low. This is soil moisture ranking percentile, is in some of the lowest percentiles over eastern Nevada into Utah and even up into Idaho and to a portion of north central Nevada. So again, with the lack of snowpack, lack of snowmelt, that did contribute to the soil moisture. Again, very low there. We did see a green up this year, also perpetuated by a late April wetting period that did allow green up to reemerge. However, it was generally short-lived and generally poor across the region. Looking at our drought conditions, we still have generally severe to extreme drought over nearly all of the Great Basin, which is kind of the orange to red colors. The only exceptions are parts of central Idaho that are in the moderate drought category, and then parts of western Nevada that are abnormally dry or in moderate drought. But really, across all of southern Idaho, further south, we are seeing a lot of those extreme drought conditions. And even in southwest Idaho, right along the Nevada border, we are still seeing some exceptional drought. Looking at our Great Basin rangeland fire probability, this really just takes into account our fine fuel conditions, and really the main areas that we are still seeing some carryover fine fuels as well as some new growth is across southern Idaho and northern Nevada, although some areas a little bit less than what we saw last year since we did lose some of the carryover. But some of the interesting things in the higher elevations that we are seeing because of the lack of snowpack is we are seeing reports in Utah and other areas of fine fuel loading that's higher than normal, or tall grass in some of the high elevations that's typically not there. So that's definitely noteworthy and attributed to generally that low snowpack that didn't compact those fine fuels. So a quick look at our fire danger and how it's changed over the last week. So last week we saw very critical conditions, and we still are seeing those, but just not quite to the same level. We saw ERCs above the 97th or 99th percentile across the southern areas of the Great Basin, and even further north up in Idaho, where you're seeing ERCs above the 80th percentile. However, fast forward to just a couple days ago, after the cold front moved through, we saw significant moderating of our fire danger up in the north, especially in the mountain areas. So that's going to take some time before that really recovers. However, in the lower elevations of southern Idaho, even though we did see a significant drop in fire danger, we'll see those lower elevations rebound pretty quickly, since a lot of those lower elevation concerns are attributed to the fine fuel loading, which obviously will dry out quite a bit quicker. So again, still not losing our situational awareness up north. We did see some slight modification in southern areas just with the colder temperatures that we saw for a couple of days and slightly higher humidity with the cold front. However, those areas, as we'll see on the following slides, will bounce back very rapidly. So a quick look up north in Idaho and Wyoming. Again, saw a very significant drop in our fire danger conditions. And for the mountain areas, again, will take quite some time before we reach the levels we were at previously, which was really just above the 80th percentile. However, in western Wyoming and eastern Idaho and some areas that didn't see as much precipitation, those ERCs will rebound a lot faster and probably get to levels we were seeing before any of that moisture within the next 7 to 10 days. Looking at Nevada, we also saw a similar drop, not quite as extreme in some areas, but again, ERCs will be bouncing back fairly quickly. And over southeast Nevada in the southern portion of the Ely district, again, we will be bouncing back very rapidly, maybe not quite to the levels we were at this time last week. However, we will quickly get there in probably the 10-day time frame. So looking at live fuel moistures across the state, we are seeing below normal sagebrush fuel moisture. We're seeing some grasses, maybe more continuous, but not necessarily high fuel loading, but we are seeing some of that. And the fires we are seeing are fully consuming the sage and the brush. As far as southern Ely, we obviously had a more significant situation with the Cane Springs fire and Grapevine fire. We were seeing a very extreme fire behavior, especially in the pinyon juniper, specifically the juniper, where we were seeing fires burn from juniper to juniper and generally disintegrate and really not needing that low elevation fine fuel loading to carry it because we really don't have much of that down south. So again, we are seeing some very extreme conditions still in southern Nevada. Moving over to Utah, again, we did see that moderation of the fire danger as well, but again, over the next 7 days, fire danger quickly returning to close to where it was in some situations, and maybe it might take about 10 days due to hotter and drier weather we are going to see return. Looking at some of our fire conditions and our live fuels, obviously a very extreme situation in Utah. We have quite a few large fires and team fires, really growing at all elevations in all fuels. We're seeing reports of sagebrush that is now starting to experience stress from the drought, so drying out very rapidly and just should expect a lot higher fire behavior than normal. So we're really seeing those conditions, again, very severe. So with that being said, we do have a fuel and fire behavior advisory in effect for eastern Nevada into Utah and the Arizona Strip. So that will continue at least through the middle of the month. And we'll probably have some updates following that, either to expand or take some areas away, depending on how things are looking later in July. But really focused on the sagebrush, fuel moistures, the pinyon juniper, the timber, all the live fuel moistures that and dead fuel moistures that are well below normal and near or at critical levels for the time of year. So now that we've kind of looked at everything in the past, we'll go a little bit more into the future. So we do have a change occurring within the ocean regime, transitioning from a La Nina last year to a neutral and now going into a rapidly developing El Nino. We do see much of our impacts from El Nino in the winter, so we won't talk about those right now, but we do have some impacts in the summer that are a little bit more mild, but definitely impact our weather pattern. We tend to see a little bit more troughing along the west coast, which can give us more wind in the Great Basin. We also see the monsoon either suppressed or maybe a little bit more sporadic. So we are expecting moisture with the monsoon this year, but we'll see how consistent that moisture is, especially as we get further north in the Great Basin. So those are some of the impacts we see from El Nino, along with very warm temperatures in the west, both attributed to El Nino and some other ocean areas that are very warm as well. So again, here's a look at our forecast, or from the Weather Service or from the Climate Prediction Center. Really all the models indicating that strong shift to El Nino, rapidly warming temperatures. So we could see a very strong El Nino developing through the summer and into the fall, and it might peak sometime in the fall or winter. So a quick look at our sea surface temperature anomalies. This black box is really where El Nino and La Nina is classified, and you can see over the last few months how quickly those temperatures are warming. So again, we are really transitioning into that and very rapidly going to see El Nino escalate. Another comment, we do have obviously the El Nino region down here in the southern part there along the equator, but also in the North Pacific, we have very warm temperatures. And this is a little bit unusual to see warm temperatures up north with this cooling along the west coast in Alaska while we have a developing El Nino. So definitely some differences occurring this year, which is kind of throwing a wrench in some of the weather predictions and the expectations that we're seeing. So a quick look at the forecast. This is from the Climate Prediction Center for the month of July. Those very warm temperatures in the west really don't seem to be ending anytime soon, aside from some of those fronts coming through that have come through already, but really the predominant temperature regime is above normal. And then still looking for the monsoon to develop. This is for July. I would say right now for the first half of July, we're looking at still dry conditions and warm conditions across the Great Basin. I would think if we start to see some moisture, it's going to be mid to late July before we see that. So I think things will get worse before they'll get better, especially in Utah and eastern Nevada. Then the 3 month outlook from August through October really doesn't change that whole pattern too much with the warm temperatures and potentially the above normal precipitation in the Four Corners area, but we'll kind of see how that plays out. This does keep Idaho and parts of western and northern Nevada and even Wyoming on the fringe of that moisture. So that's always something we look at as a potential for dry lightning or windy conditions without getting that more consistent wetter conditions from the monsoon. So those are all things we're monitoring. So putting all that together, July, it doesn't look a whole lot different for our fire potential concerns really than June did. We still are continuing that above normal across much of the Great Basin, really more critically across Utah, the Arizona Strip, and into eastern Nevada. And eventually southern Idaho will dry out and we'll start to see those lower elevation fires pop up like they have earlier this season. And then up north, again, in central and eastern Idaho and western Wyoming and those higher elevations, it will take some time before those fuels really recover. So we're looking at more of a normal type of July before those fuels really dry out. And then above normal, right along the Sierra front, again, looking at some of the brush, some areas that do have the grass that's more continuous and taller than other areas. So still some concerns there. As we move into August, especially late July, August, we should see some modification of areas in the south from the monsoon moisture, but we'll just wait to see how continuous that moisture is. Because if it's more sporadic, doesn't last very long, we may not get the impacts that we're seeing, that we're expecting to see by August. So we definitely something to keep an eye on for the Eastern Great Basin. And then up north and out west, being on the fringes of that moisture, likely staying drier, warmer. We do expect eventually central Idaho, those higher elevations up north, to really get in the game come August and possibly into September. So you can see we are keeping the above normal into September. Right now, again, we'll kind of see how the moisture plays out with the monsoon. We could shave some of these areas off if we do see either some monsoon moisture that moves further north or we get tropical features that kind of get pulled up from the southwest flow, because typically in an El Nino year with very warm waters in the Pacific, we tend to have a more active tropical season off the coast of Mexico. So that's always more available moisture that could be pushed up into the Great Basin and really change our scenario. So it is something we're watching, but way too far out to really know those details. Then by October, right now, we are just returning to normal, just in our typical fashion, returning to the fall, cooler temperatures, less daylight. We will be watching, obviously, how things unfold. If we have to carry something above normal in October, obviously it would be because we just have less moisture overall. And we always kind of watch the fall cold fronts in areas that we do have above normal fine fuel loading, because we tend to get really strong winds with those fall cold fronts. So that is something that we'll kind of monitor a little bit closer. And then just a quick look at the national picture. Aside from the Great Basin, obviously areas to our east and south have been busy so far, and we do expect areas to our north and west to get into a higher fire potential scenario, especially come later in July, going through August, potentially into September. So that concludes our seasonal outlook for this month. Check back next month for our latest updates.